Hello. Hello to our beautiful panelists. And hello to all of you. If you can hear me, you are at Global Toronto 2020, Day 3. And in the panel, has capitalism failed the music community? And spoiler alert, if you think the answer to that question might be no, you might be in the wrong panel. Before we start, I want to acknowledge once again the physical location of our conference headquarters and the land from which I am personally broadcasting. It is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. It is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Many of us, including myself, are here today because the Toronto Inuit Place Forum in Toronto. And I'd like to acknowledge and thank all Indigenous peoples who share this land with us and allow us to be here as uninvited guests. In this panel, we're going to be looking at some of the ways. Can everyone hear me okay? Panelists?
Okay. Kind of. Can you hear us?
I can hear you perfectly. Am I coming in and out?
It's blocking on my end, but I'm not sure how other people are.
Okay, I'm going to keep talking. Let me know if you cannot hear me. Just let me know in the chat. Okay, so in this panel, we're going to be looking at some of the ways in which the current economic models driving our industry have failed, damaged, or excluded many of its most valuable contributors and the originators of music and material that brings us all here. In the face of persistent injustice, some have had the fortitude not only to continue to show up, but to forge and foster systems that promote equity and a more sustainable future for a broader range of stakeholders. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves, and I'm going to close out of this window and open it again while you do that. Can you hear me at all?
Oh, okay. Do you want us to introduce ourselves? Yeah. Oh, wait. Where did Amy go? Good morning, everyone. ShoShona. Ian, can you hear me? Okay. I guess I'll just start. I think Amy's going to come back to see if we can hear her better. Okay. I'm Rose. I'm from a band called Lal. It's my Miss Murray. I'm from Bangladesh. I'm in Brampton. You can see my business. We also run Two-Spirit and Friends, underground alternative space in Toronto out of our home. And we just do a lot of stuff.
We're having some technical difficulties at the moment. Can all of the panelists mute themselves? Okay. Can everyone hear me now? Panelists, can you hear me? Okay. Okay, can everyone keep themselves muted? And one by one, can you unmute yourself? So Ian, can you unmute yourself and introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Ian Kamau. I'm an artist, writer, designer from Toronto.
And now ShoShona?
Anin Bojo, Jaush Kobanazekwe Desnikas, Megazido Dem, Bachwana, and Donjaba, My name is ShoShona Kish, and I am an artist and organizer, mom, wife, daughter.
And Rose.
My name's Rose, and I'm in an electronic duo called LOL with Nicholas Murray. And we also run Unit 2, which is an alternative underground space for queer and trans and two-spirit and friends, and also support a lot of stuff in Toronto.
Okay, so panelists, can I ask that we just keep ourselves muted unless you're talking? So we'll unmute one at a time. Rose, I think if you have the video stream open on more than one screen, that might be the source of the technical problem. Okay, so by way of further introduction and opening up this conversation, I'd love to focus in specifically on this notion of community. Whose community, what communities? And I'd love if you can each speak to specific communities that have been exploited, undervalued, devalued, blatantly excluded from the present capital musical industrial complex, and specifically those communities which have motivated you to create work, artistic, social, political, or otherwise. And why don't we go right to left? So Rose, if you can start.
Sorry, Amy, could you just repeat that once more?
Yes, so I'm wondering if you can speak to some of the specific communities that you have found to be underserved, underrepresented, exploited, or left out of the current music industry as a result of power and political imbalances enacted by capitalism.
Okay. So our work specifically deals with these communities, and for the most part, I think in our case, queer, trans, two-spirit, BIPOC folks, so Black, Indigenous, people of color in general, have been left out of a bigger national dialogue in this country. Yeah, women, differently abled folks. That's kind of the work that we do, just based on our own experiences as musicians. So that's where I would sort of like, that's who we work with, and that's what I feel like is being left out for sure.
Rose, can you mute yourself and ShoShona? Can you speak next?
Yes. Well, yes, I mean, I echo what Rose is saying in terms of, I mean, the focus of my work, and I think perhaps one of the key parts of it's impossible to examine colonialism and capitalism without looking at the shadow of that. And, you know, it's really meant to support and benefit a very small I'm trying to think of how to say this. Capitalism only serves some and not many. And so, you know, I think communities that we talk about as marginalized communities are often or always left out of that conversation. But I think it's important for us to realize that capitalism actually isn't serving anyone except that, you know, 1%. And much like colonialism, you know, it's not something that really has any benefit for people at large, regardless of your background or your race or your religion or your gender, or like to me, it's a system that we have to examine at its root and understand in a very broad sense. And so it's difficult to have this conversation without talking about systemic racism and injustice. But I think that we need to understand that capitalism is at the root of that happening to all people around the world. And in that sense, I think it's really key for us to, it's not happening to them, it's happening to us. My work is largely focused on my own community as an Indigenous Anishinaabe woman. I feel like it's very important for us to start at home, and so that's been sort of my pivoting point to this work. But I really see it as being all of us who are doing, social justice and environmental or reimagining work we're talking about not just one community. We're talking about those really powerful places of intersection.
And I think we can also put into question how much that 1% is benefiting and what benefit actually is. I mean, we can talk more about value and wealth and poverty later on in this discussion. But certainly that intersectionality is important because we are all complicit in this and we are all affected by it, though absolutely not in the same ways. Ian, can you speak to what you've seen among particular communities within this industry, or perhaps when markets exist, the lack of infrastructure to support them?
Yeah, I mean, any community that doesn't generate profit for the companies is a community that isn't being served by those places. I don't think the intention is, I don't think that intention of like the industry or whatever is to support communities or whatever. It's an industry. It's, it's made to generate profit. But I mean, the people that are left out of that reality are basically anybody that doesn't fit the mainstream. So everybody that Rose mentioned, 100%. It's the lowest investment for the highest return. And so if people feel like if the industry as it is feels like the whatever is mainstream or whatever are the things that are going to sell the most to the most amount of people, then that's essentially what they go with, and that leaves out probably the vast majority of the populations that exist on the planet Earth, quite frankly.
And there are other parameters that impact, that define who those are that are left out, that intersect with these issues of, as Rose and ShoShona mentioned, that intersect with racism and other existing systemic hierarchical imbalances within the broader system outside of the music industry proper. I'm wondering if we continue on this notion of communities, if we want to talk about groups of people, either who are included or excluded as specific communities. I'm wondering about the value or the necessity of creating autonomous spaces, protected sovereign spaces outside of capitalist and maybe other dominant political, social, or market structures. This is something, Rose, that you've done with Unit 2, ShoShona, even within the mixed industry space of the Indigenous Summit, you were careful to reserve safe spaces for Indigenous-only members. And I'm just wondering about this approach, when it might be necessary or why it might be necessary, as opposed to engaging in a more directly in trying to more directly counter or fight against or change the dominant system. What is gained from investing in a space apart? What is sacrificed in taking that tactic, as opposed to engaging with the system that exists. So maybe Rose, if you can start by talking about your experience in creating sovereign spaces.
Yeah, and I want to, like, I come from the Bangladeshi community. My parents came in the 60s, and they had always created their own sovereign space, the Bangladeshi Association. And so communities have been doing this for a long time. There's always been an alternative to the industry. And I like to call it the ecosystem, where we connect in different ways, across nationally and internationally, because many of us are looking for a different experience. And so I think these spaces, I think this idea that people from the ecosystem can't do well, people actually do well. Their focus just may not be on international dominance, because there's an ethical practice behind what folks are trying to do. So I think that is important to say. I think what's happening is that the industry now is beginning to clock and being forced to clock that the fact that they're fucked. They're kind of fucked up, and that they've been many times propagating all kinds of shit towards people, and now they're being called out. And so that we're at a really interesting time where possibly, and independents are doing really well. There's this clash of critical meets pop culture. There's all this stuff happening. So there is a moment where maybe some of the industry will change. It will take time, For us, these spaces like Unit 2, are really important, even from the hip hop scene in the 90s in Toronto, the techno scene. It's still like that, like in some ways, like we would have our own communities that would be packed. It'd be word of mouth, it'd be through flyers, the money would go to the artists as best as possible. There were, corporate concerts and stuff like that, but there's always been, those of us have been trying to do alternative programming. And for Unit 2, we recognize as artists of color, my partner is Black and I'm Bangladeshi, that we didn't have the support, the mentorship. We did really well in the early 90s, but then we hit this spot where we didn't have the mentorship. We would go into, venues and there wouldn't be anybody who looked like this. There was no management, there were no agents. There are still very little. And so we decided after my mother passed to create a space that was welcoming to QT, BIPOC, and friends. Because a lot of us have dealt with so much crap at venues or within the industry. So we were like, well, we're not going to do that. We're going to do something else, make it smaller, really focus on the small and the intention behind actually real safe space. I literally can sit at the top of the stairs over there and watch the whole room and walk back and forth to make sure energies and people are okay. And I actually now, we work with Cokes and Ray Spoon. Ray also, when they transitioned, went through a lot of transphobia and still does in many other sectors. And they kind of encouraged us to, let's not worry about the industry. Let's just focus on what you all do in communities that you want to work with. And that's what we've been doing. And it doesn't mean that we don't intersect and we don't get invited to things, usually through people that we know. But we really love this. I personally love the small. So I'm committed to continuing that work. And I'd love to see artists get bigger and bigger. I just think there is a sacrifice and a consequence that we're not always warned about when those things happen, particularly who's in power around us. And in Canada, when you look at the administration behind a lot of bands of color, they're still white. When you look at the industry as a whole, not just the artists, we've always had artists. We need to have diversity within journalism, to labels, to granting bodies, to education, to government. The whole shit needs to change.
Yeah, is an understatement. ShoShona, yeah, as someone who's trying to both set up these systems and also negotiate between those systems and create openings for those systems and these broader systems, all of which need to change. I'm just wondering about your experience in what the value that you've found from generating those spaces apart, or what you've had to give up in doing that.
Yeah, that's a really big question. I think, the value of creating safe, autonomous spaces that are based on community values is essential for the health of our communities. I think when we are always forced to operate by different value systems within different frameworks and compromise all of the things that are required within that, we spend so much time and so much of that work and energy that we have and so much of our labor just navigating to be there. Or negotiating to be there. And I've spent a lot of time in that negotiation and navigation, and I think really worked hard to generously come to those spaces when that's been the only option. But I really celebrate the opportunity to not have to go through that kind of labor simply to stand in my own values and with my community and have the critical conversations and do the critical building and inspire one another and on our own terms. I think that's it's just one of the things that I value the most. And I think that it's not so much about being separate, it's about being able to stand in our own center rather than always, like as an Indigenous person, I spend 99% of my life in colonial systems that are not constructed on our teachings or our value systems or our ways of knowing and being. So every time I step into that world, it's an effort, it's a compromise. And I think there's value in those efforts and compromises that we make for one another, but I really look forward to there being increasingly diverse spaces that I can stand in and spaces that can be held in more mutual ways for mutual benefit, where there isn't this baseline or assumption made that the white or mainstream constructs are the base, like that's where we start from and everything else is in relationship to that. So I think there's a big conversation for us to have there, and I think that one of those fundamental places that we keep having to refer back to, and just like so much energy going back and forth, is the economic models that we're forced to operate within, that require us to assign value and in this really strange way and talk about what benefit truly is or what value truly is or what wealth truly is, and all of those things that are really not the culture base that I come from. So I hope I answered your question, but this is certainly what I think about in terms of how we're holding spaces, how we're sharing spaces, and what spaces we're dreaming next. I think this is a big consideration.
Yeah, I am very excited to unpack some of those other systems of value, other and othered, in this context, in our present dominating context. But just further to this idea of the space that you can stand in fully. We see, I mean, per Rose's point, we see great value in the small, a particular type of value that we don't get as things scale, or that we lose in other ways. There's so much is gained, and more generous economic systems that are not so based on reciprocal relationships or exploitative relationships, on which capitalism is based, that are not as competitive as the broader system, can be cultivated in these smaller spaces, partially because trust is present. And trust is something that gets harder to control. I mean, Rose, when you were talking about having control over the space, over the energy of the space, over how safe the space is, these become more difficult concepts when we're in communities that are not as small, or are not, maybe where the individuals within the community are not united by the same value identity systems, or even marginalization, which among other things can be a unifying force in these spaces apart. So I guess I'm wondering, is any of this translatable to professional environments, to commercial environments that are more directly embedded within and in service to the broader capitalist system? What learnings, if any, can we take from these other spaces, these lesser known spaces? And what what preconditions and changes do we need to make in our professional commercial systems in order to bring in some of that energy that is possible in the separate spaces? Rose, I'd love to hear your take on this, particularly as you've been so engaged in social justice education.
Would it be okay if I heard Kamau or ShoShona first? Just because I'm curious. It helps me form my own thoughts.
Ian, do you have any thoughts on this one?
Was that to me? Sorry, I didn't hear that.
Yes.
Yeah. I think your question is incredibly complicated. I think I think any of these autonomous spaces, whether they be our individual spaces like a home studio, or whether they be places like Unit 2 that bring in the public, or communities of people that are organizing amongst themselves, those sort of things. I think those spaces are always under the foot of the economic system in one way, shape, or form, because at the end of the day, it's like still in one form or fashion, we have to pay our rent, we have to pay our bills, we have to pay our internet, we have to pay for our cell phones and all these various things. And so I think all those autonomous spaces, or those places to be able to create and to build community and those sort of things, are incredibly important. But I also think that individuals that have decided that they are going to ensure that those spaces continue to exist, that those people often burn out, have mental health issues, have health issues in general, because they're going up against something that it has so much power and so much influence and so much sway over our lives that you don't even really have a choice as to if you're going to interact with it. So I think those spaces are important, but I also think that those individuals or those groups of people that are trying to build those spaces also have to really focus a lot on supporting each other, on building up their own health and wellness, and understanding the thing that they're kind of up against.
And ShoShona, can you speak to, I mean, you work with a lot of different groups and you do a lot of advising within the broader industry. How do you approach these topics as they pertain to making this kind of change in systems that are more directly tied to capitalist structures?
I'm not 100% sure I know what you're asking me, but if I feel like we're in such a broad space. But I think one of the key words that I heard was about trust. And when we're navigating in through shifting relationships and creating potential for change, was part of the question, how do we build and nurture trust in these spaces?
Yes, no problem. I'm wondering to what degree trust is translatable to commercial context, professional context, businesses that are operating within capitalist systems, and what can be learned from professionals operating in those systems around changing internal culture.
Right.
To more aligned
Thank you. Yeah. Well, you know, I think
if
colonialism, right. Colonialism and capitalism, in my opinion, are not breeding grounds for trust, nor are they conducive to sort of healthy mutual well-being, like intersectional spaces. It really is about profit and bottom line. And so I think we need to really examine those sort of basic premises of what our culture is based on, what our economy or systems are based on. Because I think there's some really big assumptions that are sort of, we're spoon-fed for a very long time and then begin to think are sort of our only alternatives. And part of it has to do with language and how we define things, you know. So I think that if we want to get into the kind of, well, I know we want to, as we get into the kind of culture shift, and there certainly is an opportunity in front of us to really do some heavy lifting and look inward, and help one another, you know, really interrogate these systems that are not serving us. And I think that we have to look at things, we have to look at like the DNA of culture. So if we're looking for culture shift within organizations or culture shift within systems, the DNA of culture is built into language. So we're working within English, which is a colonial language, and there are all sorts of nuanced things that are hard to speak about even in English words outside of the framework of colonialism and capitalism, simply because the language does not articulate those things easily or well or at all. But I do think that, you know, when we're, yeah, you know, I remember I was sharing this with you, Amy. It's, you know, I remember my mom was talking about profit, and she was just like, I don't understand this profit thing. Like, why is profit the end game for all of the ways that, you know, the system interacts in economy? It is the baseline for what we value and why we value it and what we're working towards when we engage in it. And she said, profit is all about having more than you need. It's taking more than you need. And she, you know, she was just, we spoke about it at length, but she was talking about, you know, this idea of creating abundance and balance in a way that's mutually beneficial, that is very much what the Anishinaabe teachings speak about, you know. And so I think when we talk about benefit and profit, there's a way for us to talk about that outside of the capitalist system, but we really have to kind of dig deep and really even understand the words that we're using. And so I think that, coming back to your question, and I don't mean to be super long-winded, but these are big questions. I think that we have to like go look at those really foundational things and interrogate them deeply, right down to the words we use, how we string them together. Perhaps there are words that we need that we don't have right now in the English language. And it's difficult to have a conversation without the words. And in some ways that's literal, and in some ways I mean that as a metaphor, in terms of having the tools we need to do this work when we are so exclusively operating within the system.
It requires such a shift at every level. Cognitive, epistemological, social, cultural. Rose, I'd love to hear if you can speak further to this, because it is such a massive topic, and it is, those joining us are looking for practical input in terms of, you know, knowing the system's broken, wanting to make change, micro within their organizations as well as blowing the full thing up. What can that actually look like? Where can we actually start with that?
Well, and sort of like also just referencing what ShoShona and what Kamau said before I sort of give some suggestions. These systems don't work for most of us. So even like the for-profit, not-profit model, they don't really work. So having said that, there are things that, you know, industry for me means polluting the water, fucking with the earth, fucking with people. So I don't even like the term industry. But looking at who works at your organization. If you look around and you're seeing just a bunch of white folks, you know, you have a problem. You know, depending on what kind of organization you are in terms of like if you have a specific mandate for Black community or for Indigenous community or for whatever community. But a lot of the industry, when you look around, who's at the table? Who's missing from the table? You know, who built the table? You know what I mean? Like, so there's all these things that industry can do, and not in a tokenistic way. It's like, how do you actually create relationships with people? And I think that's a number one. Like, look around at who's sitting at the table, who's got power. Are you sharing power? How are you sharing power? Because not everything always has to be about money. I think all of us at some regard, because of our communities and who we interact with, we're always talking to each other. And I think industry forgets that as people of color, as BIPOC folks, we're always talking to each other. I call them like secret little meetings that we have that, you know, people don't always know about. And I think the reason I bring that up is because, you know, people in power just think that we don't know what we're doing half the time. Not always, but there's an assumption made that we're not already connected. So I think folks need to understand that we are connected. You know, if some shit's going down in your organization, there's a good chance a lot of us are going to know what's happening. You know, I think looking at equitable hiring practices, like that's something that people really need to investigate. Not just from, there's this thing happening for a while in Canada where we're highlighting artists of color, but that doesn't necessarily change something for the entire community. It changes for that one artist. And then that one artist kind of gets trapped in trying to survive and then forgets about community often, is what I've experienced. And it's not their fault, it's just how the industry works. So it's undoing that. It's about like, you know, taking time and building those relationships outside of the networks that you already know. And the industry for me tends to stay within the industry. Like I worked at a record store for a long time. I worked for Tommy Boy. If I want to look for industry, I know where to go, right? I don't see industry looking outside of their own selves a lot of the time. So, and then in a city like Toronto, there's so much stuff happening from like journalists, managers, writers, educators, artists. You just have to simply go somewhere else. And I think to really investigate, you know, that there once was a time, at least in my experience, people who were high ups in the industry loved music. And then somewhere in like the late 90s, 2000s, you got in people who were just business. Like, and so that's a big problem when people don't love music and the arts and they're trying to make decisions about art. That's even worse. So it's got to come back to the art, the people, and the community. And I feel like we're seeing those shifts, but not at the rate in the city of Toronto when we have, 55% is people of color. That should be represented in every aspect of this city, including the music industry. You know, and I think those are just simple things that people can start to look at. I hope that was helpful.
Go to where the art is not these are not revolutionary concepts, and yet they're not in play and have not been in play. I would love to talk about the elephant in the room of that has sort of been touched on a few times. You know, we do want to be able to benefit from the system. We do want to be able to succeed within this industry, which is, we've always been told, been predicated on competitiveness. You know, there's this quote, the only thing worse than being exploited by a capitalist is not being exploited by a capitalist. So we're trapped in this, those of us who want to make change, but also want to succeed in the industry, in this impossible, seemingly, conundrum of wanting to think otherwise, not yet knowing what that is, wanting to participate, but also knowing that the whole thing needs to implode. And I'm just wondering about how if each of you can sort of speak to the ways in which you navigate this tension within your personal practice, artistically, or in your community and social practices in working with other artists in the industry. Maybe Ian, if we could start with you.
How do I navigate it? I have no idea how I navigate it. I have no idea. If I could have given up being an artist, I would have given up being an artist a long time ago. If it didn't stay inside of my head, if it wasn't something that constantly was nagging me, that I woke up in the morning thinking about, I probably would have done something easier, or something at least that, you know, had a path that was a clear path inside of the wider system. And I wouldn't be thinking about capitalism, anti-capitalism, how to get around it, what independence is, what true value is. I probably wouldn't be thinking about any of that. However, those are things that I think about because I do wake up in the morning just wanting to make things all day. I don't know that I've ever been inside of the industry per se. I know some people I've spoken to in the last little while disagree with me on that, but I never had any desire to be inside of the industry. I did have a desire to be able to do my art and share it with people, like people that would appreciate it in some way. That's the thing that has enabled me to travel all over the world. I mean, through the conduits of some of these corporations, like if it wasn't for Facebook or Instagram or these things that are owned by enormous multinational corporations, I probably wouldn't have been able to tour or anything like that because, you know, I never had management or a booking agent or a publicist or anything like that. Predominantly, what I was able to do was about people. But it is, you know, but it on some level, you do wake up in the morning being like, I wanted to do music. I want to make music and share it. And then you see like, you know, Drake or whatever, just like dancing on the, on the internet or something. And you feel like, yeah, I was never able to get to the place where enough people cared about what I was doing that I could just do it and continue to share it with people. And so there's some level of like feeling like a tinge of like wanting to be involved in that, like a jealousy or a being pushed out of something because of the initial desire. And, you know, I think an artist like Drake probably has a similar desire to share, you know, but yeah, I think that's the thing. It's the difficulty in living your whole life just wanting to participate essentially in a community, but needing to interact with some kind of an industry because of the system that we're in order to do the basic thing that you need to do. Because as I said before, at the end of the day, I'm in a system where I have to figure out how to pay rent on August the 1st, you know.
ShoShona?
Yeah, I think the tension that you're talking about is real. It's a real thing that I find very challenging. I feel like I, not even necessarily always by choice, but always have been engaged in some way in subverting the system, partly because I think sometimes that's what you have to do to survive. And also just this deep awareness of, you know, the possibility for change. And so if we are not sort of, when we are required for various reasons to stand within that system, to be a part of this catalyst for change, and you know, because that's happening in all sorts of really profound ways and has been as long as I can remember. And I certainly was very blessed to grow up in an environment where I was surrounded by artists and activists, and that, you know, the work that was happening around me when I was a little girl is very connected to the work that's happening right now. And I know that change feels too slow. It is tiny incremental shifts, but I think that we do this work now not for us, but for those 7 generations in the future. And we know that our job is to just be one small part of that shift and that change. And to me, like, art has always been about that. And anything that I do sort of in tandem with my art around industry has been about that. And all of the community building things that I feel very committed to and inspired to doing, none of that really has been a choice. It really is all connected. And, you know, for Anishinaabe people, they talk about how wealth is not about how much you have. It's about how much you have to give, how much you have to share. And that isn't about this, like, this cultural thing we're all navigating right now, where we're fighting burnout at every turn because we're working so hard. It's about having enough to take care of ourselves, and then, you know, then having more to give because of the abundance that you're building, more to share. And so I think about that a lot. And I think that has been a real motivating force for me. So, like, at the core of what drives me and where I find empowerment in the work is in that sense of working for the 7th generations, and in that sense of being like an instrument of change and working towards creating the kind of abundance that allows me to share and create more mutual spaces and lift and amplify those, you know, like, just in this very balanced, broad way. And so I think about these things. These are the things I wake up thinking about, is just like, who, and I know that we sometimes feel like we're in isolation in this work because we're out there, you know, in these really colonial spaces all the time. But, you know, you were talking about how we navigate, like, the competitiveness, or, you know, being forced into these systems that are so contrary to our values. And, you know, anytime that I find myself confronted with those things, I refer back to these teachings about what true wealth is and what our roles are, to walk gently and clear a path for those next generations. And there's a teaching about the 8th fire in Anishinaabe tradition, and this fire will be lit in our communities at a time when the healing is done, when the recovery is done, when everyone is healthy and things are in balance. That will be the time of the lighting of that 8th fire. And we are in the 7th fire right now, according to our prophecy and teachings. And I think about this a lot, about what it means to get to a place where we can light that eighth fire. And so as I try and navigate all of this system, all of the challenges and like heartbreak and burden of navigating this system, which is so contrary to where my teachings come from, these are the things that sort of keep me on track. And then it helps me find my way through.
And I love that, because that's kind of the place where I feel like I work from, in terms of partially because I was born on this territory, partially because of Sufi and Bawal ancestry and my own Muslim heritage. So a lot of what we do is we're always giving back as much as we can. So I no longer, as an artist, feel like I need to chase after the industry. I did it for a long time. It was very painful. And then I realized I can be a bitter bitch or I can change my attitude, and, you know, find joy, like just look and participate in what that looks like. So that's what we essentially did about 10 years ago. And a lot of that was through Unit 2, is like, so for us navigating the industry, because we're still connected in some ways because we're still making music, but it's supporting each other. It's like, you know, sharing grant information, whispering to the folks of color or the queer folks that I come across in the industry, hey, like, let's have a conversation. And a lot of the time we're talking about the same things. So it's really, it's what ShoShona was saying too. It's like, it's subverting, like we're constantly subverting. And so that's what I feel like is important, because I think there's this mentality that you have to be part of the industry to do well. And again, that's a myth to me. If you focus on your community or your audience, we have the tools now to be able to do that. It's just building the team. I think we forget about teams, and you really need to build a strong team of people. We need to push back and demand that we are at the table, particularly with the granting bodies, and not just as recipients of grants, but as in decision makers as well. So I think we have 10 minutes left. I can't focus anymore on trying to prove to somebody else my worth. Fuck it, I know what I'm worth. You know, all I can do is just stand in my power. And if I have community who want to participate in that and do well in that, then I'll support you as much as I can. You know, in my experience, a lot of us who have sort of climbed our way up this industry ladder, and what Kamau was saying, we end up burning out big time. Mental health stuff, exhaustion. You know, I can't tell you the number of times that we've actually housed or held people at our house simply because of the impact of these forces. So that's also what we try to do is make room and actually care for people, you know, and that's a very different stance than just wanting to be a well-known artist. Like, and also the understanding that, you know, I'm first generation here. Nick is first generation, I guess. We're just the building blocks of weirdo people, BIPOCs of color. Like, we do really weird shit, and the Canadian industry gets it. The Canadian audience gets it. The industry does not get with who and what the fuck we are. But we understand that we are part of the building blocks of this city. You know, we're 28 years deep as a duo, and we're really happy. You know, we're happy because we've surrounded ourselves with good people, and we're constantly fighting for justice, but together. And there's something about that gives me hope. And lastly, I'll say I had to look outside this country to look for representation in terms of queer or trans or women or non-binary. And so I found She Said So, which is based out of Portugal, which is an international network of women and queer and non-binary folks in the music industry. and, as artists or the industry. And yeah, it has some work to do. But I was blown away at the conversations that this community is having, that some of us are having here. But I'm talking like major industry people are on this or in this community. And, we're able to somewhat have these discussions openly. I'm not seeing that in Canada. So I've had to look outside this country to look for that kind of sort of shift in the industry.
A lot to be said for how we use our time together this week, and what we can gain from that. We have 5 minutes left. I would love to open the floor to the chat room. If you have burning questions, please do put them in. We have chance for at least one or two. And thank you so much for bearing with us and these technical difficulties. Very grateful. Sorry for that rocky start, and apologies to my panelists. I feel I didn't get to greet you or thank you properly for being here, but it's really an honor to be having this conversation and to be surfacing these your personal insights around these incredibly fundamental, hugely important, extremely complex issues. I'm not seeing any questions from the chat room, so I'm going to ask another one of you. But chat room folks, please feel free to jump in at any time. With regards to these changes that need to be made, which we don't have time to scratch the surface of here, at this particular moment, in light of everything that's happening, I'm wondering for each of you where you're seeing the most opportunity or the most urgency around change that needs to be made, and where you're investing your time right now in light of that.
I can go quickly. Right now, a lot of our focus has been on Black and Indigenous community, simply because, just because of the way racism has impacted, or all kinds of shit has impacted, and what's happening currently. Also queer and trans, like Two-Spirit folks, racialized folks. That's kind of what we're focusing on. I should mention, also have started to program for Illuminato, so also trying to bring and engage like those communities into that space as well. So, yeah.
ShoShona, your focus in your work right now around systems change?
Yeah, I think that I really, the things that I feel like this community at large, and I don't know who's joined at this panel, but I think, like so many of my friends and colleagues, I'm really focused on racial justice. And I think as we are, really preoccupied with COVID and the state of what's happening south of the border, as well as, around the world, I think that there are a whole bunch of really serious environmental things happening. And corporations are pushing through some pretty big moves while we're all looking the other way. And so I'm really concerned about that. And in terms of the capitalism conversation, I think that we need to be having, just broadly having this generous conversation of how, doing good should not be is not in conflict with doing well. So when we make socially responsible, environmentally responsible decisions for our organizations, our communities, the corporations, that doesn't have to be at the expense of creating a healthy, sustainable, corporation. For instance, as we look to moving outside of that model, I don't even know if we don't have those words yet, like I was talking about earlier, but I think first we have to wrap our head around the idea that creating abundance does not have to be about creating an imbalance, and that we don't have to be exploitive, and perhaps expansion is not always the way forward. Sometimes contraction is a powerful place to be too. And so this is the kind of, it's just, I would really like us to have brave conversations. And that's what I've been focusing my time on, is having brave conversations whenever I can. And amplifying voices. I think stories are magic, and arts are going to help us find our way forward and see where we're going next. So I think it's really important to be amplifying those voices and stories that need to be heard, and being really thoughtful about how we do that.
That could not be a better note on which to leave. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you to this righteous group of panelists. Total honor. Please keep up this work. Please keep telling us what we need to hear. And let's make the changes that we want to see. Fellow members of the industry. Thank you.